Sweetheart, I think the caterer's entrance is around back.
Are you sure this ticket belongs? Sit in the back! My seat is 2AA. Don't make this difficult for yourself. You just made the most. Brooke, do you know who you just served? A billionaire wouldn't dress like that. Cancel the 8:15. All of it.
What happened?
I can't stay silent.
What have we done?
No, you can't do this! Was withdrawing the money your revenge? The slap?
Keep watching the story and follow Mr. Marcus Stories for more powerful moments.
The sound of the slap did not echo so much as it landed, flat and final, the way a door closes when someone has decided a conversation is over. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the cabin of that private jet moved, and in aviation, 3 seconds is a long time. The flight attendant stood with her palms still raised at shoulder height, her chin tilted up in a way that suggested she had rehearsed this posture somewhere, sometime, without ever expecting to need it. The woman she had struck did not flinch, she did not gasp. She simply stood there in a gray hooded sweatshirt, with rain still darkening the shoulders, and she waited, the way people wait when they already know how a story ends and are simply letting the other person catch up. Nobody on that jet knew her name. Nobody had bothered to ask it. They had looked at a black woman in worn sneakers, dragging a single, scuffed carry-on across the tarmac of Carolina Executive Air Park at 9:52 in the evening, and they had made a decision about her in less time than it takes to blink twice. That decision would cost the company that owned this aircraft $191 million before the sun came up again. Not eventually, not over a fiscal quarter, in a single night. Her name was Adrienne Cole. And this is the story of what happens when an organization built entirely on appearances runs headlong into a woman who had spent 31 years learning to see past them. It began as these things nearly always do, with something forgettable, a canceled evening flight out of Douglas International, storms rolling off the coast faster than the forecasters had promised. Adrienne had been coming back from 4 quiet days at a cabin near Boone, the kind of trip she took twice a year with no phone alerts and no assistant trailing 3 steps behind her. She liked disappearing. She had learned a long time ago that the only honest way to understand how any company actually treated people was to become, for one evening, a person nobody thought mattered. So, she kept the hoodie on. She kept the wireframe glasses that did nothing but soften the shape of her face in photographs she had learned to avoid. When her commercial flight evaporated along with 280 other seats that night, she did what she had done 4 times before. She called Meridian Charter Services and booked the next available seat on a jet operated under the Vantage Aviation Group banner, a company whose board she had been quietly negotiating with for 7 months. She did not tell them who she was. She never did. That was the entire point. The jet waiting at Gate C4 was the kind built to make ordinary people feel important: ivory fuselage, brass trim along the stairs, the particular hush of an aircraft that costs more per hour than most families earn in a year. 3 other passengers were already seated when Adrienne climbed the stairs at 10:14 p.m. A couple from Myrtle Beach in matching golf polos glanced up once and returned to their phones. A man named Chad Petrosky, who would later be quoted in 4 separate news articles by his own request, sat with a bourbon already sweating a ring onto his tray table, his tie loosened, his voice already 20% too loud for the size of the cabin. Stark. The flight attendant who met her at the top of the stairs wore a name tag that read Brooke. Brooke Sinclair had been with Vantage for 9 years, and in that time she had built a very particular kind of confidence, the kind that comes not from being right, but from never once having been corrected. Her eyes moved over Adrienne in a single practice sweep. A hoodie, the sneakers, the absence of a designer bag, a watch, anything glittering enough to announce itself. Something in her expression cooled, the way a room cools when someone leaves a door open in December. Boarding confirmation, Brooke said. It was not a question. It was closer to an accusation. Adrienne handed over her phone. Business class seat 2A confirmed at 9:41 p.m. for a fare of $4,117. Brooke stared at the screen for 11 seconds, long enough that Chad Petrosky noticed, long enough that he leaned into the aisle with the loose, satisfied grin of a man who has decided he already knows how tonight is going to go. "Sweetheart," he said, I think the caterer's entrance is around back. On. The couple in the golf polos said nothing. They had become extremely interested in their sparkling water. Humiliated. Adrian did not look at him. She looked at Brooke, and she waited because waiting, she had learned, is its own kind of statement. I'll need to verify this, Brooke said, as though a fully paid business class confirmation had arrived handwritten in crayon. Please wait here. 4 minutes passed. Chad made a comment about people who don't understand carry-on sizing. The golf polo husband checked his watch twice, not out of concern for Adrian, but out of concern for his own dinner reservation. When Brooke returned, she wore the specific expression of someone who had gone looking for a problem and was irritated not to have found one. Everything appears to be in order, she said, and the word appears did all of the actual work in that sentence. But due to weight balancing, you'll be seated toward the rear. My seat is 2A, Adrian said quietly. I'd like to sit there. Something tightened along Brooke's jaw. I would strongly advise, she said, low enough that only Adrian could hear it, that you not make this difficult for yourself. My seat, Adrian said again, is 2A, and then Brooke's hand moved fast, unthinking, the motion of someone who has genuinely never once imagined consequences attaching themselves to her own actions. The sound cracked off the cabin walls and hung there. Chad made a noise somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. The golf polo wife grabbed her husband's forearm. The recessed lighting kept humming along, indifferent, the way expensive lighting always does. Adrian reached up. She straightened her glasses, which had slipped half an inch. Sitched me. She looked at Brooke with an expression that was not anger. It was something far quieter and far more dangerous. You have just made, she said, her voice barely above the hum of the cabin air, the single most expensive decision of your career. Brooke did not apologize. She would not apologize for the next 6 days, not once, not in any form that could reasonably be called an apology. She told Adrian, with the flat authority of a woman reciting a manual she had never actually read, that the flight would depart in 11 minutes and that any further disruption would result in her removal from the aircraft. Somewhere near the galley, a phone camera's tiny white recording light blinked awake. Adrian noticed it. She said nothing more. She walked to the last row, sat and folded her hands in her lap, and for the remainder of boarding she did not look at Brooke Sinclair again. Here is the part worth sitting with for a moment, before the story moves forward. Brooke did not stop being pleasant for the rest of the flight. She refilled Chad's bourbon with a warm, practiced laugh. She brought the golf polo couple their sparkling water with a smile that had been entirely absent 40 seconds earlier. The unpleasantness had not left the cabin. It had simply been aimed precisely at one person, and everyone else on board had quietly agreed to let it happen, which is its own kind of participation. When the pre-flight snack service came around, Brooke set a tray down on the empty seat beside Adrian, without a word, without eye contact, the way you might set something down near furniture. Chad received warm cashews in a small ceramic dish with silver tongs. Adrian received a foil packet of crackers slid across the armrest. She ate nothing. She watched the runway lights fall away beneath the aircraft at 10:31 p.m. and thought about very little except the meeting, scheduled for the following morning at 8:15. The one she now understood, with a strange and settled clarity, was never going to happen. Near the forward galley, a young flight attendant named Casey Lindqvist had been watching all of this unfold with the particular discomfort of someone who knows something is wrong and hasn't yet found the words for it. School. She was 23. She had been with Vantage for 11 months, long enough to have learned exactly how much deference Brooke expected and exactly how little of it Brooke had ever earned through kindness. But something about the woman in the back row was tugging at the edge of Casey's memory, a face she was almost certain she had seen before. Somewhere printed, somewhere official, attached to a headline she couldn't quite place. She slipped back to the galley tablet and pulled up the flight manifest. She found the name. She read it once. She read it again. And then she went very still, because the name attached to Seat 2A carried a VIP flag she had only ever seen twice before in 11 months, and the profile photograph loading slowly over the aircraft's weak satellite connection matched unmistakably the woman folding her hands in the back row. Adrian Cole, founder and majority owner of Cole Dynamics, a data infrastructure company she had built out of a converted laundromat storefront on the east side of Charlotte 14 years earlier, back when nobody wanted what she was building and everybody, eventually, needed it. Casey knew the broad strokes the way most people her age knew them, a name from a magazine list, a face from a business conference photo, but what she found next, buried 3 screens deep in an internal investor portal, Brooke had once logged into and never logged out of, made her set the tablet down and press both palms flat against the galley counter to steady herself. Adrian Cole owned 14% of Vantage Aviation Group's outstanding equity through a holding entity that appeared on no public filing, no press release, no executive biography anywhere. For 7 months, she had been in private negotiation with the Vantage Board to lead a rescue investment of $191 million capital the airline needed to survive a debt restructuring that would otherwise have grounded half its fleet by spring. Assume the signing had been scheduled for 8:15 the next morning. 4. Casey looked up from the tablet. Down the aisle in the last row, Adrian Cole sat with her hands folded and her eyes on the black window, and there was something in the stillness of her that did not belong to a woman who had simply absorbed a humiliation and moved on. It was the stillness, Casey would say later, of somebody making a decision. She was right. In her hoodie pocket, Adrian's phone lit briefly. She had typed 4 words to a man named Nathaniel Cross, her lead counsel, a man who had been half expecting this message since the deal had first taken shape 7 months earlier. She put the phone away. She looked out the window as the wheels came down, and the runway lights of Douglas International rose up to meet them at 11:47 p.m. Brooke stood at the forward door as passengers deplaned, thanking the golf polo couple by name, offering Chad a warm farewell as he stumbled past with one final comment about women who didn't know their place. Stolly. She looked straight through Adrian, as though the seat had been empty the entire flight. Stornio. Adrian walked down the stairs into the rain without turning around. She found her driver waiting at the edge of the private terminal, climbed into the back seat, and made 2 calls before the car had even cleared the airport gate. The first was to Nathaniel Cross, confirming the message already sent. The second was to her assistant, a calm, unshakable woman named Denise Farrow, who answered on the first ring at nearly midnight the way she always did. Cancel the 8:15, Adrian said. All of it. Formal withdrawal letter out by 3 a.m. standard language, no explanation attached. Denise asked no question. She never did. That was precisely why Adrian trusted her with everything. Back on the jet, Casey Lindqvist stood in the galley holding the tablet with a sick feeling spreading slowly from her chest into her arms. She had gone to the cockpit and told the captain what she'd found. He told her Brooke had already briefed him, that the situation had been handled, that she should reset the cabin for the next leg. She had gone to Brooke directly, voice barely steady, and told her plainly what the manifest showed. Brooke had looked at her with something close to pity, the particular pity adults reserved for children who've said something embarrassingly wrong in front of company. Adrian Cole is worth close to $1 billion, Brooke said slowly, as though explaining arithmetic to someone who couldn't read a clock. She would not be flying charter in a thrift store hoodie. Quieter, let it go. Don't go hunting for trouble that isn't yours to find. Casey nodded. She walked to the back of the empty cabin and sat down in the dark with the tablet in her lap for a long time. And then she did the exact thing she had just been told not to do. She wrote a detailed incident report, time-stamped, factual, unemotional, and attached the investor profile in the flight manifest. And at 12:34 in the morning, she sent it to the Vantage Director of Passenger Services, the head of Human Resources, and the executive assistant to the company's CEO. Then she sat very still, the way a person sits after doing something they cannot undo, and she breathed. That email landed in the inbox of Gregory Vance, chief executive of Vantage Aviation Group, at 12:34 a.m. He was asleep. It would sit unread for hours. What woke him at 3:02 a.m. was a different email, entirely 3 lines from Nathaniel Cross's office, formal and unambiguous, confirming that Adrian Cole's investment vehicle was withdrawing entirely and immediately from the proposed $191 million transaction, effective as of that moment, with no further comment offered at this time. He read it once, he read it twice. He turned on the lamp and read it a 3rd time, And then he opened Casey's report. And by the time he finished reading the attached manifest for himself, he understood, with the particular, nauseated clarity of a man watching solid ground disappear beneath him, exactly what he had allowed to happen on one of his own aircraft. By 5:30 a.m., Gregory had been on the phone for over an hour with the board chair general counsel and the head of investor relations. By 6, 3 board members had been pulled from their beds. By 6:45, someone in investor relations had mentioned, carelessly, to an assistant who mentioned it to a contact at a regional financial wire, that there might be a development affecting the morning's planned announcement. By 7:03 a.m., a 4-paragraph item had gone out under the headline, Vantage Aviation Faces Wednesday Morning, after reported investor withdrawal, sourced to unnamed industry contacts restrained in tone, devastating in arithmetic. Markets opened at 9:30. By 9:41, Vantage stock had dropped 6%. Raw. By 10:12, it had dropped 13. A former board member who had resigned 18 months earlier over a governance dispute gave a brief, measured, damaging quote to a business outlet by 10:30. By noon, the stock was down 22%, and the company had shed somewhere between $58 and $71 million in market value in under 4 hours, depending on the exact minute you chose to measure it. The board called an emergency session at 1 Malay p.m. Gregory Vance sat at the head of a glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor and watched people he had known for a decade look at him with the specific expression powerful people reserve for the moment they have identified who is going to absorb the consequences of a disaster. The question that would not stay buried was simple. Why had Adrian Cole walked away from a deal 7 months in the making, with contracts reviewed 4 separate times, the night before signing, without a word of explanation? Someone remembered Casey's report, still sitting untouched in 3 inboxes. It was read aloud. The room went quiet. Someone requested the cabin's security footage, and it took 41 minutes to load onto the conference room screen, and then 31 people watched, in total silence, the exchange at the top of the stairs, the 4 minutes of waiting, the slap, cracking off the cabin walls in high definition. Gregory Vance said 4 words into the silence that followed. They were not the most elegant 4 words ever spoken in a boardroom, but they were, everyone agreed later, entirely accurate. What have we done? Brooke Sinclair was summoned to Vantage's headquarters by a text to her personal phone at 9:15 that morning because her company phone had already been remotely locked at 9:01. She arrived at 10:40 still in her full uniform, out of instinct, the way people reach for armor without quite deciding to. The security guard at reception asked quietly for her access badge. Her corporate email had already been deactivated. She was walked to a small windowless room on the 2nd floor, where 2 people from Human Resources and 1 from Legal sat waiting with the specific neutral expression of people who already know how the meeting ends. She still believed, in those first minutes, that this was a misunderstanding that the passenger had exaggerated, that 9 years of service record would speak louder than 1 bad evening. She said so, twice. Nobody responded. Then the attorney slid a printed still from the cabin footage across the table, and something in Brooke's face changed. It was not remorse. It was the specific white shock of a person realizing, for the first time in her adult life, that the world is not, after all, arranged around her being right. Outside, the story had already left the building. By 2 p.m., 3 national outlets had the footage. Advocacy organizations issued statements. 2 Vantage corporate sponsors announced internal reviews, which in that language always means a slow, careful exit. A prior passenger came forward, describing an almost identical incident from 14 months earlier that had been settled quietly with a non-disclosure agreement. Or then a second one did. Then a third, a retired schoolteacher named Willa Boone, who described being told, on a different Vantage flight 2 years prior, to move to the rear galley because her ticket must have been a mistake, and who had simply absorbed it the way most people absorb these things, because pushing back had never once, in her experience, changed the outcome. Adrian Cole gave no interviews that day. Her publicist, a measured woman named Sylvia Ashcombe, who understood the strategic value of a particular kind of silence, confirmed only that Ms. Cole was aware of developments and would speak when it was appropriate. The appropriate moment, as Sylvia and Nathaniel Cross had quietly agreed, was 4 p.m. The following day, late enough for the public's own conclusions to have already formed around the documented facts, so that Adrian's voice, when it finally arrived, would land on ground already shaped in her direction rather than ground she had to shape herself. She appeared on a national financial broadcast the next afternoon, seated in a gray chair under studio light that made her look precisely like what she was composed, unhurried, entirely herself. The anchor, a 23-year veteran named Diane Whitfield, who had interviewed cabinet secretaries and tech founders alike, would later say Adrian Cole was among the most controlled interviewees she had ever sat across from. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform outrage. When Diane asked how it had felt, Adrian was quiet for a moment, and then said something that would be clipped and replayed hundreds of thousands of times before the week was out. "The slap isn't the story," she said. "The slap is just what made the rest of it visible." The real story is that someone believed she had the right to treat another human being that way, based entirely on what that person looked like. That's, that's not a vantage problem. That's an everywhere problem. I just happened to be in a position where it couldn't be ignored. Diane asked if she would reconsider the investment. Adrian said the offer had already been formally withdrawn and would not be revisited. She said she intended instead to direct that capital and more into a partnership with a smaller regional carrier called Cascade Air, a company that had approached her 11 months earlier and had spent that time quietly proving, in documented and unglamorous ways, that its values weren't decorative. Cascade stock, thin and largely uncovered by analysts, rose 34% in after hours, trading within 20 minutes of the interview airing. What followed for Vantage was not a single event, but an unraveling the specific kind that begins at one loose thread and doesn't stop until the whole structure has shown its true shape. Gregory Vance resigned within the week, citing a desire to spend more time with family, language that tends to belong to men who were never actually offered a choice. The board commissioned an outside audit of company culture, motivated less by conviction than by liability, which sometimes produces identical actions regardless of motive. 3 crew members from that flight were placed on administrative suspension, Brooke Sinclair among them, though by then she had already stopped answering calls from anyone she didn't recognize. 2 of Vantage's 3 largest institutional investors requested emergency briefings, the specific kind of request that really means explain to us why we shouldn't sell. So one of them sold anyway, the following Tuesday at 10:47 a.m. Brooke stopped leaving her apartment much by the end of that week, not by any formal order, but because her face had become recognizable in a way it had never been before, and would not stop being for a long while yet. She had never seriously entertained the possibility that the woman in the hoodie wasn't beneath her. That certainty had been the floor her whole professional life stood on, and now it was simply gone, and what remained in its place wasn't yet recognizable as anything at all. 6 days after the flight, she sent a message through her attorney requesting a meeting with Adrian Cole. She expected silence. She received 3 days later a single reply, 1 hour, time and location to follow. She had Cole Dynamics offices on the 19th floor of a building she had driven past 100 times without ever knowing whose name was on the lease, wearing no uniform, carrying nothing but her own hands. She had spent 3 days rehearsing what to say and abandoned every version of it in the elevator, because none of it felt honest enough for a woman who had already seen straight through everything false. Adrian was already seated when Brooke came in, a cup of coffee in front of her, her phone face down on the table, her full attention given to the room in a way Brooke found, irrationally, worse than coldness would have been. "I'm sorry," Brooke said. "I didn't know who you were." Adrian set down her coffee. She looked at Brooke for a long moment, the way a person looks at something they've spent a great deal of time thinking through and are only now finally seeing with total clarity. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole explanation. You didn't know who I was. That's the part you think helps you." She paused. "You think respect is something people have to qualify for. Something. Something they have to prove before you decide whether they've earned it." Brooke opened her mouth, closed it. "I grew up getting that exact look," Adrian said, From teachers, from loan officers, from men in blazers on airplanes, my whole life not for anything I'd done, for what I looked like, and what people assumed that meant about who I was. Ah, I have sat in boardrooms as the only person who looked like me and watched people decide, in the first 30 seconds, exactly what I was worth to them. Uh, and I absorbed almost all of it for years because pushing back cost more than most people ever have to pay to simply be believed. Light. She was quiet a moment. You weren't even a little bit worried you might be wrong. Ah, that's the part that matters. Can you forgive me? Huh. Brooke asked, and the words came out broken in the middle. Adrian was quiet for a long time. I don't know yet, she said finally. That's honest, at least. What I do know is that what you do next matters more than whatever I decide. She stood. The meeting was over. Casey Lindqvist received a call 4 weeks later from a number she almost didn't answer. It was Denise Farrow, calm and direct, explaining that Coal Dynamics' new partnership with Cascade Air had an opening for a director of passenger experience, and that Ms. Cole had personally asked that Casey be considered. The interview lasted 40 minutes. Time. Adrian asked her why she had sent that report at 12:34 in the morning, after being explicitly told not to. Score. Casey thought about it and said that she'd known what she'd seen was wrong, and that if she'd gone to sleep without acting on it, she would have woken up the next day as someone she didn't want to become. Adrian nodded slowly and asked nothing further on the subject. The offer came the next day. Casey accepted it in under an hour. Vantage stabilized eventually, at a considerably lower altitude new financing at unfavorable terms, a restructuring that would take 3 years and leave the company roughly half its former size. Cascade Air, by contrast, grew and did so under conditions written directly into Adrian's investment contract: mandatory ongoing training in respectful service, an internal reporting line for discrimination complaints that bypassed direct management entirely, quarterly third-party audits of crew conduct, and executive bonus tied in part to anonymous passenger dignity surveys. Willa Boone, the retired schoolteacher, was invited to speak at the first all-staff training session 18 months later, and did. Aftermath. Adrian stood at a podium 11 months after all of it, at the opening of a small technology mentorship center in the Charlotte neighborhood where she'd grown up. 4 blocks from the laundromat that had once housed the first 4 employees of Coal Dynamics' sleeping on air mattresses behind their monitors because none of them could afford anything else. She spoke without notes. Real power, she told the room, isn't the kind borrowed from a title or a badge or a set of assumptions about who belongs where. Real power is what's left standing when everything else has been stripped away, and it comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when a room is doing its level best to convince you otherwise. It takes most of a life to learn that. It's worth every year of the learning. She let that sit for a moment. And the quietest person in a room is very often the one paying the closest attention. The one who, when it actually matters, already knows exactly what to do. See, she stepped down without lingering. In the hallway, Denise was waiting with her coat and a coffee at exactly the right temperature, and the two of them walked out through the back entrance the way they always did, into an ordinary Charlotte evening, past a school letting out, past a laundromat with a hand-lettered sign in the window, past a woman in scrubs, asleep upright at a bus stop, resting in whatever increments the day had left her. Adrian watched her until the car turned the corner. She thought, as she often did afterward, about the thousands of people who never got a headline out of a moment, like hers, who absorbed it and simply went home. She thought about what any of us owe each other, once we happen to end up holding the kind of power that can make the world answer for itself. Treat people like people, fully, before they've had to prove a single thing. It isn't a new idea. It's one of the oldest there is. We just keep forgetting it, and every so often, the world gets reminded in terms it can't look away from. She hoped, with the quiet, earned patience of someone who has watched real change happen slowly and knows exactly what slow change actually looks like, that this had been one of those times. Declaimer. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice, through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.